He was such an influence in the French Baroque that Ravel would later come to write a piece about his tomb. Well, not exactly, but it's close enough to sound cool. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about François Couperin. François Couperin came from the famous Couperin family of French musicians, famous in France much as the Bachs were famous in Germany. But just as many Bachs came and went without leaving an indelible mark on music history, so too did many Couperins, until François' uncle, Louis. The family's musicianship centered around keyboard instruments. At that time, it was just the organ and the harpsichord. François was born into this family in November of 1668, 7 years after the death of his famous uncle Louis. François' father, Charles, passed away before he was 11, but the boy had a great support system in the form of other organists in the area who were very kind to both him and his mother. Being from the Couperin family, he had a lot of musicianship going for him already. Though he wasn't formally employed as the organist at his father's old church until he was 18, he still received a stipend from them because he performed occasionally on the harpsichord, and, well, he was still fairly well liked. He married in 1689 into an affluent family, and the year after, coinciding with the death of his mother, his first collection of published pieces came out. François thus became the first Couperin to actually have pieces published, a great luxury in those days. And even though his uncle Louis was well known for his original compositions during his lifetime, these never got published. They just stayed in manuscript form, and they've only been rediscovered relatively recently, which is incredibly fortunate. Most pieces that just exist in manuscript from the Baroque era have not survived. While still serving as the organist at his father's old church, Couperin was also tapped to be a court composer, where he was able to hobnob with big shots and write chamber music. This made him extremely busy, especially for a man who suffered from ill health throughout his entire life. Nevertheless, he was extremely gifted in the compositional arts, and he set about blending the styles of France and Italy. Those styles were quite different, and finding ingenious ways of combining them fascinated composers until the Baroque era petered out. Couperin was, by his own admission, indebted to the work of the Italian composer Arcangelo Corelli, who is widely credited with cementing tonality as we know it. Couperin's duties included giving weekly Sunday afternoon concerts, as well as giving lessons to members of the nobility, which included various princes and princesses, and, at one point, the Duke of Burgundy. While the organ was a big part of Couperin family life, François only ever published one collection of organ pieces. The rest of his published work was for solo harpsichord instead. From 1713 to 1730, he published over 200 pieces for solo harpsichord, which are organized not into suites, which are characterized by the use of the same key in every movement, but rather into something he called the ordre, literally order, where the first and final movements of each ordre would share a key, and, well, there wasn't as much strictness when it came to tonal center in the intervening movements. This would become the model for the as-yet-to-be-invented genre of the symphony. It was Couperin's concept of the ordre, with 27 examples across 4 books, that influenced Maurice Ravel when he wrote his Le Tombeau de Couperin, literally the tomb of Couperin, but this really isn't a good translation. It's literal, but it doesn't capture the meaning, which is something more like memorial. It's an old-fashioned title, and it indicates more of the style in which Ravel was working, and the composer he was trying to imitate, or at least emulate, or have an homage to, or he's involved somehow. On top of all this, the titles that Couperin would give his pieces often were incredibly mysterious. They were the ancestors of the kinds of vague and otherworldly, occasionally, titles that Debussy would give his piano preludes. Perhaps the most famous one is one called The Mysterious Barricades, for which there are literally dozens of speculated meanings. Couperin himself was careful not to explain what exactly was being mysteriously barricaded, and so a lot of the guesses have more to do with the nature of who's doing the guessing. Now, at that point, a lot of things required monarchical approval, especially publication. I mean, you just gotta keep the people in line, you know? Anyway, in 1713, he got a 20-year permit to publish his own pieces, and he really got on the ball pretty much immediately. This publication is one of the big reasons that we actually know of Couperin's work today. They called him Couperin the Great, but it's questionable if we'd still be calling him that if his work did not survive in published form. He worked his way up to be the biggest of the big shots in the court, but he didn't last long at the top between the death of Louis XIV and his own declining health. Little is known about the last decade or so of his life, save for the fact that he slowly had to relinquish his varied musical posts because of his ill health, and the fact that sometime in there his son disowned the family and left. There's probably a story there, but nothing that I could find that seemed credible. It was a slow decline for Couperin throughout the 1720s, and he passed away in 1733. This was initially going to be the final year of his royal publication permission, but he had had it extended for another decade, which obviously he couldn't use on account of him being, dead. His many fans over the years included Johannes Brahms, who loved the ordre and performed them, albeit on the piano, in the 1880s. In France, his music was loved and cherished from Berlioz to Dandy to, of course, Maurice Ravel. And liking Couperin is probably the only thing that those three could agree on. In addition to founding a school of keyboard music that would influence every French composer thereafter, Couperin was also a pedagogue. He wrote two treatises, one on the proper execution of figured bass, and the other on proper harpsichord technique, which serves as the starting point for any musician looking to accurately perform Couperin's work. It was in this treatise that notation for ornamentation, prolific throughout the entire Baroque era, was first standardized. In Couperin's time, composers were not expected to include a lot of detail when it came to ornamentations in their pieces, and it was expected that, in addition to whatever ornamentation might actually be included in the score, that performers would often take many liberties and include lots of different ornamentations for taste. In fact, if performers didn't do this, it was considered bad taste. Couperin did not like the idea that he had to put up with all this extra ornamentation added into the score by the performer. He had very specific things in mind. Ornamentation wasn't just an added element to show off how good a harpsichord player was, but rather it was a fundamental part of the musical texture. He conceived of ornamentation in really a different way. The unpardonable negligence of improper performance grated on Couperin to the point that he is, by my count, the first composer to say that his work had to be played specifically as written, which would not come to be standard until the classical era. The fingering standardization found in the same treatise influenced J.S. Bach. Thus, it is Couperin who has more influence on keyboard technique than anyone else from the era, possibly more influence on keyboard technique than anyone of all time. The two composers probably corresponded, but if so, that has been lost. In all, Couperin's life is a reminder of how little of the Baroque era we actually know. With publication not even uncommon, but in fact a rarity and a luxury, many pieces were lost to time. By some estimates, up to 90% of all pieces written during the Baroque era have been lost. His publication license was the only thing that saved him too from complete oblivion. And whatever works that he wrote that weren't published almost certainly lost themselves.